Detective Amanda Ross found her sister's mutilated body arranged in a perfect circle of black candles, but the most disturbing part wasn't the ritualistic scene. It was the fact that Amanda felt absolutely nothing when she saw it. Just clinical curiosity about the killer's methodology and a strange sense of satisfaction at the artistic composition. Amanda had always prided herself on her emotional control during crime scenes, but this was different. This was her baby sister Melissa, the person she'd protected and loved more than anyone else in the world. She should be screaming, crying, falling apart. Instead, she found herself photographing the scene with the same detached professionalism she'd shown at hundreds of other murder investigations. The realization that something was fundamentally wrong with her emotional responses hit Amanda like a physical blow. She'd spent 12 years as a homicide detective, convinced that her ability to remain calm and analytical made her exceptional at her job. But standing over Melissa's body, Amanda began to wonder if her emotional detachment was actually a sign of something much darker lurking in her psychological makeup. Amanda's partner Jake arrived at the scene and immediately noticed her unusual behavior. While he expected grief, shock, or at least some visible distress, Amanda was calmly discussing evidence collection procedures and potential suspect profiles. Jake had worked with Amanda long enough to know she processed trauma differently than most people, but this level of detachment felt disturbing even for her. The crime scene itself told a story that made Amanda's blood run cold, not because of its brutality, but because of how familiar it felt. The positioning of the body, the symbolic arrangements, the careful attention to aesthetic details, everything about the murder reflected a mindset that Amanda recognized from her own thoughts during particularly challenging cases. It was as if someone had reached into her subconscious and acted out her darkest professional fantasies. Amanda's childhood had been marked by violence and neglect, experiences that had shaped her into someone who could compartmentalize extreme trauma. She'd always believed this ability made her stronger, more capable of handling the psychological demands of police work. But looking at her sister's crime scene, Amanda began to question whether her coping mechanisms had actually been warning signs of something more sinister developing in her psyche. The investigation quickly revealed that Melissa had been researching their family history in the weeks before her death. Her apartment contained genealogy charts, old psychiatric records, and newspaper clippings about violent crimes committed by distant relatives. Melissa had been trying to understand something about their shared genetics, some pattern of behavior that had worried her enough to spend months documenting their family's dark legacy. Among Melissa's research materials, Amanda found a journal entry dated just 3 days before the murder. Melissa had written about her growing concern that Amanda showed signs of antisocial personality traits, specifically a lack of empathy and an unusually high tolerance for violence. Melissa had been planning to confront Amanda about seeking psychological evaluation, fearing that her sister's job was bringing out dangerous tendencies that ran in their family line. The psychological profile that emerged from Melissa's research painted a picture of a family tree, riddled with individuals who had committed acts of extreme violence, often against people they claimed to love. The pattern suggested a genetic predisposition toward psychopathic behavior that manifested differently in each generation, sometimes remaining dormant until triggered by environmental stressors like exposure to repeated trauma. Amanda spent that night reading through Melissa's research, forced to confront the possibility that her emotional numbness wasn't a professional asset, but a symptom of the same psychological disorder that had driven multiple family members to commit horrific crimes. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying, but what scared Amanda most was how intellectually fascinating she found the whole analysis. As dawn broke, Amanda realized she was facing two equally disturbing possibilities. Either someone had murdered Melissa to prevent her from revealing the family's psychological legacy, or Amanda herself had committed the crime during some kind of dissociative episode and couldn't remember doing it. Both scenarios suggested that the darkness Melissa had been researching was very real and very active. The investigation would force Amanda to delve deeper into her own psychological makeup than she'd ever wanted to go. She would have to confront the possibility that everything she thought she knew about herself was wrong, that her greatest professional strengths might actually be symptoms of a profound psychological disorder that had already claimed her sister's life. Standing in her empty apartment, surrounded by evidence of her family's violent history, Amanda made a decision that would change everything. She was going to solve this case, even if it meant discovering that she was both the detective and the killer she was hunting. The truth about what her brain was hiding from her was about to surface, and Amanda suspected it would destroy everything she thought she knew about herself. Dr. Sarah Chen had been studying criminal psychology for 15 years, but she'd never encountered a case quite like Amanda Ross. The detective sat across from Sarah's desk with the kind of calm composure that immediately triggered every warning signal in Sarah's professional training. Amanda was either an exceptionally well-adjusted individual dealing with trauma, or she was a high-functioning psychopath seeking validation for her own disturbing thoughts. Sarah had agreed to evaluate Amanda at the request of the police department, ostensibly to determine if the detective was psychologically fit to investigate her own sister's murder. But within minutes of their first session, Sarah realized she was dealing with something much more complex and dangerous than simple grief counseling or fitness for duty evaluation. Amanda described finding her sister's body with the same emotional tone she might use to discuss the weather. She provided clinical details about the crime scene, analyzed potential suspect motivations, and discussed her investigative strategy without showing any signs of personal attachment to the victim. Sarah recognized the symptoms of emotional numbing, but Amanda's presentation went far beyond normal trauma responses. The psychological assessment revealed a pattern of behaviors that made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. Amanda showed no physiological stress responses when discussing traumatic events, demonstrated an unusual fascination with violent crime details, and seemed to view other people primarily as sources of information rather than as individuals deserving of empathy. These weren't typical grief reactions. They were indicators of fundamental deficits in emotional processing. Sarah's clinical notes from their sessions painted a picture of someone who had, learned to mimic appropriate emotional responses without actually experiencing them. Amanda could describe what grief should look like, could articulate the theoretical impact of losing a loved one, but couldn't demonstrate any genuine emotional connection to her sister's death. This kind of emotional simulation was characteristic of individuals with severe personality disorders. The most disturbing aspect of Amanda's psychological profile was her complete lack of insight into her own condition. She genuinely believed her emotional detachment was a professional asset, a sign of mental strength rather than psychological dysfunction. This blind spot suggested either profound denial or the kind of grandiose self-perception that often accompanied antisocial personality disorders. During their third session, Sarah made a breakthrough that changed everything. While discussing Amanda's childhood, Sarah noticed that Amanda's pupils dilated and her voice became more animated when describing acts of violence she had witnessed or imagined. Amanda was experiencing genuine emotional arousal, but only in response to thoughts of harm being inflicted on others. This pattern of arousal in response to violence was a classic indicator of sadistic tendencies. Sarah found herself in an ethical dilemma that challenged everything she thought she knew about professional boundaries. Amanda was clearly dangerous, but she was also a police officer actively investigating crimes. Sarah's duty to protect potential victims conflicted with her obligation to maintain client confidentiality, especially since Amanda hadn't explicitly threatened anyone or confessed to any crimes. The psychological evaluation also revealed that Amanda possessed above-average intelligence and exceptional manipulation skills. She had learned to present herself as a dedicated professional while concealing her true emotional responses from colleagues, supervisors, and even herself. This level of deception required sophisticated psychological insight and years of practiced performance. Sarah began to suspect that Amanda's choice of career in homicide investigation wasn't coincidental. The job provided legitimate access to violent crime scenes, allowed her to study criminal behavior firsthand, and gave her authority to interact with both victims and perpetrators. For someone with Amanda's psychological profile, police work would be the perfect cover for exploring and potentially acting on violent impulses. The breakthrough came when Sarah asked Amanda to describe her ideal crime scene. Amanda's response was immediate, detailed, and delivered with the first genuine emotion Sarah had observed during their sessions. Amanda described a scenario that matched her sister's murder in every significant detail, including elements that hadn't been released to the public or documented in official reports. Sarah realized with growing horror that she wasn't just evaluating a detective who had discovered her sister's body. She was conducting a psychological assessment of the person who had most likely committed the murder. Amanda's emotional numbness wasn't a response to trauma. It was the natural state of someone incapable of forming genuine human connections. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Sarah reviewed Amanda's employment history. Every jurisdiction where Amanda had worked had experienced an increase in unsolved murders with similar ritualistic elements. The crimes had been attributed to different perpetrators or left as cold cases, but they all shared Amanda's distinctive attention to symbolic details and aesthetic composition. Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could report her suspicions to the authorities, but Amanda's position within law enforcement would make it easy for her to discredit any accusations. Alternatively, Sarah could try to continue treating Amanda while gathering more evidence. But this approach would put other potential victims at risk, while Sarah tried to build a case against a trained investigator who understood how psychological evidence worked. That night, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. She was going to document everything she had discovered about Amanda's psychological profile and create a comprehensive case file that could be used to stop her if she struck again. But Sarah also knew that by taking this approach, she was essentially using herself as bait to catch a predator who had already proven capable of murder. Detective Lisa Morgan had been tracking a serial killer for 8 months, but she never suspected her own colleague until she found Amanda Ross's fingerprints at the 4th crime scene. The realization that she'd been working alongside a predator, sharing case details and investigative strategies with the very person she was hunting, made Lisa question everything she thought she knew about reading people. Lisa had always prided herself on her ability to spot deception and manipulation, skills that had made her one of the department's most successful interrogators. But Amanda had fooled everyone, maintaining her cover as a dedicated professional while using her position to select victims, gather intelligence, and stay ahead of the investigation. The psychological sophistication required for this level of deception was both impressive and terrifying. The pattern became clear once Lisa knew what to look for. Amanda had been volunteering for cases that matched her victim preferences, offering to work extra hours on investigations she was secretly sabotaging, and providing profile insights that subtly misdirected the investigative focus. She'd been playing a game with law enforcement, demonstrating her intellectual superiority while hiding in plain sight. Lisa's investigation into Amanda's background revealed a career built on carefully constructed lies and manipulated evidence. Amanda had transferred between departments frequently, always leaving just before patterns in local crime rates might have raised suspicions. She'd cultivated a reputation as a hard-working detective who burned out quickly due to emotional investment in her cases, when in reality she was simply moving on before her activities could be detected. The psychological profile that emerged was that of a highly intelligent predator who used her law enforcement position to perfect her crimes. Amanda had access to forensic techniques, understood evidence collection procedures, and knew exactly how investigations were conducted. This inside knowledge made her nearly impossible to catch using traditional investigative methods. Lisa realized that Amanda's supposed emotional breakdown over her sister's death had been a calculated performance designed to generate sympathy and deflect suspicion. Amanda had murdered Melissa to silence her, then used the crime to reinforce her cover story as a grief-stricken survivor rather than a cold-blooded killer. The psychological manipulation involved in this strategy revealed a level of planning and emotional calculation that made Lisa's skin crawl. The most disturbing discovery was that Amanda had been studying Lisa's investigative methods for months, learning her patterns and preferences in order to stay one step ahead of the investigation. Amanda knew Lisa's psychological profile as well as Lisa knew Amanda's. creating a cat-and-mouse dynamic where both predator and hunter were analyzing each other's every move. Lisa faced the challenge of building a case against someone who understood police procedures better than most criminals and had spent years perfecting her ability to avoid detection. Traditional investigative approaches would be useless against Amanda because she knew exactly how those methods worked and had already developed countermeasures for each one. The breakthrough came when Lisa realized that Amanda's greatest strength was also her most significant vulnerability. Amanda's need to demonstrate intellectual superiority meant she couldn't resist leaving subtle clues that showcased her cleverness. She wanted recognition for her crimes, even if she couldn't claim credit openly. This psychological need for validation was the weakness Lisa could exploit. Lisa developed a strategy that appealed to Amanda's ego while gathering evidence of her crimes. She began discussing the investigation with Amanda, praising the killer's intelligence and sophistication, expressing admiration for someone clever enough to evade capture for so long. Amanda's responses revealed knowledge she shouldn't have possessed and demonstrated a level of personal investment in the crimes that went far beyond professional interest. The psychological manipulation required to catch Amanda demanded that Lisa understand and exploit the same emotional vulnerabilities that Amanda had been using against her victims. Lisa had to become a predator herself, in a sense, using psychological warfare against someone who had mastered the art of mental manipulation. The moral implications of this approach troubled Lisa deeply, but she knew it was the only way to stop Amanda before she killed again. Amanda's reaction to Lisa's investigative strategy revealed the full extent of her psychological disorder. As Lisa got closer to exposing her, Amanda began showing signs of paranoia and grandiosity that had been hidden beneath her professional facade. She started making mistakes, taking unnecessary risks, and demonstrating the kind of emotional instability that often preceded violent escalation in serial offenders. The final confrontation was building toward a psychological showdown between two women who had spent months studying each other's minds. Lisa knew that Amanda was planning something dramatic, probably an attempt to eliminate the investigation by targeting Lisa herself. But Lisa also knew that Amanda's psychological profile made her predictable in certain ways, despite her intelligence and planning abilities. Lisa prepared for what she knew would be a deadly game of psychological chess, where the stakes were measured in human lives, and the winner would be determined by who better understood the darkness that lived inside the human mind. Amanda had spent years perfecting her ability to hide her true nature, but Lisa was about to force her to reveal everything she'd been concealing. Rachel Turner never expected her routine psychological evaluation to reveal that she was living with a dormant personality capable of extreme violence. But the brain scans didn't lie. Dr. Sarah Chun's assessment showed neural patterns consistent with psychopathic tendencies that had been suppressed by years of psychological conditioning and medication Rachel didn't remember taking. Rachel had volunteered for the psychological research study as a way to help Amanda Ross's investigation into her sister's murder, not knowing that she was actually part of an elaborate psychological experiment designed to identify and study individuals with latent violent tendencies. The revelation that her entire life had been carefully monitored and controlled by researchers studying criminal psychology shattered everything Rachel thought she knew about her own identity. The research facility where Rachel had unknowingly been living was actually a long-term study of individuals with genetic predispositions toward antisocial behavior. Dr. Chun wasn't just a consulting psychologist. She was the lead researcher in a decades-long project designed to understand how environmental controls could suppress inherited criminal tendencies. Rachel was subject 47 in a study that had been tracking her since childhood. Rachel's memories of her normal suburban life began fragmenting as the truth emerged. Her job, her apartment, her relationships, everything had been carefully constructed to provide her with a stable, controlled environment while researchers observed her psychological development. The people she thought were friends and coworkers were actually trained observers documenting her responses to various stimuli and stressors. The most disturbing revelation was that Rachel's family history included multiple individuals who had committed violent crimes, including several serial killers whose cases had never been connected by law enforcement. Rachel carried the same genetic markers that had produced these predators, but her environment had been so carefully controlled that her violent tendencies had never been triggered into active expression. Dr. Chen explained that the research project had identified children with high-risk psychological profiles and provided them with intensive interventions designed to prevent criminal behavior. Rachel's medication had been carefully adjusted throughout her life to suppress aggressive impulses. Her social interactions had been monitored and managed to avoid triggering situations, and her career choices had been subtly influenced to keep her away from opportunities that might activate her latent violent tendencies. But the system had failed with Amanda Ross, another subject in the same research program. Amanda had developed resistance to the psychological conditioning, had learned to hide her true responses during evaluations, and had eventually gained access to her real psychological profile. Once Amanda understood her own nature and the extent of the control being exercised over her life, she had used that knowledge to break free from the program and begin acting on her violent impulses. Rachel realized with growing horror that her own psychological profile was nearly identical to Amanda's, and that the only thing preventing her from becoming a killer was the continued administration of drugs that suppressed her natural emotional responses. The research team had been conducting an unauthorized experiment on unwilling human subjects, using pharmaceutical manipulation to prevent genetically predisposed individuals from committing crimes they might otherwise be compelled to commit. The ethical implications of the research project were staggering. The scientists had essentially been kidnapping children with certain genetic markers and subjecting them to lifelong psychological manipulation without consent. They justified their actions by arguing that they were preventing future crimes, but they had violated every principle of human rights and medical ethics in the process. Rachel's confrontation with her true nature forced her to grapple with questions that challenged her fundamental understanding of free will and moral responsibility. If her peaceful, law-abiding behavior was the result of chemical suppression rather than genuine moral choice, what did that say about her character? Was she essentially a monster being held in check by pharmaceutical restraints, or was her medicated personality her real self? The research facility began shutting down as Rachel learned the truth, with Dr. Chen and her team destroying evidence and preparing to disappear before their illegal experiments could be exposed. Rachel found herself caught between her desire for justice and her fear of what might happen if her medication regimen was interrupted. Without pharmaceutical intervention, she might become as dangerous as Amanda Ross had proven to be. Amanda's final message to Rachel revealed the complete scope of the psychological manipulation they had both endured. Amanda had been watching Rachel for months, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about their shared situation. Amanda's murder spree hadn't been random violence. It had been a calculated campaign designed to expose the research program and force other subjects like Rachel to confront their true natures. The revelation that dozens of potential killers had been living normal lives while under pharmaceutical control raised terrifying questions about the nature of evil and the effectiveness of psychological intervention. The research program had succeeded in preventing crimes, but it had done so by violating the basic human rights of individuals who had never actually committed any offenses. Rachel faced an impossible choice as the facility prepared for shutdown. She could continue taking medication that suppressed her natural psychological responses, essentially choosing to remain a prisoner of pharmaceutical intervention for the rest of her life. Alternatively, she could stop the medication and risk discovering whether her true nature was as dangerous as Amanda's had proven to be. The psychological thriller reached its climax as Rachel realized that the study's failure to control Amanda had put her in a unique position to understand both the appeal of violence and the importance of choosing to resist it. Unlike Amanda, Rachel had learned about her condition before acting on violent impulses, giving her the opportunity to make conscious decisions about how to manage her psychological tendencies. Rachel's final decision would determine not only her own future, but also the fate of other subjects in similar programs around the world. Her choice between pharmaceutical suppression and authentic self-knowledge would establish a precedent for how society should handle individuals with genetic predispositions toward criminal behavior, raising questions about prevention, treatment, and the fundamental nature of human evil that would challenge psychological and ethical frameworks for generations to come. The human mind harbors secrets darker than we ever imagined, and the thin line between good and evil might be nothing more than chemistry and circumstance. If this psychological thriller opened your eyes to the hidden depths of human nature, subscribe now for more mind-bending stories that explore what your brain doesn't want you to know. Share this story with others who are brave enough to confront the darkness within. And comment below with your thoughts on whether we can truly choose to be good when evil might be written in our DNA. Your engagement helps us continue revealing the psychological truths that could change everything you believe about morality, free will, and the nature of human behavior.